Okay, thanks everyone for coming to this plenary session 2. And thanks everybody to stay in the conference until now. Let me introduce our second plenary speaker, Dr. Luis Miguel Rojas-Berscia. He's a postdoc research fellow at University of Queensland, Australia. His interests are the origins of language diversification in the Americas and Australia from a context linguistics and a major point of view. He is a rising star as an early career researcher. It's very pleasure to have you as a keynote speaker today. Today he's going to talk about remixing in the desert, an introduction to dynamic linguistics through the lens of Balgo, multilingual metaphor.
Thank you so much for this introduction. Rising star, maybe falling, who knows? Well, we'll see. I have something prepared for you. Let me share my screen. Okay. So here it is. Remixing in the Desert, an introduction to dynamic linguistics through the lenses of a Balgo non-polyglossic multilingual repertoire. And I have added that adjective non-polyglossic quite, well, just a few days ago, as I wanted to make emphasis on that. Non-polyglossic, which actually is behind a lot of my work most recently. And this talk will deal mostly with languages from Western Australia and from the Amazon. Of course, I know that you have very diverse backgrounds, so I won't get into much detail regarding the grammatical oddities of the languages I deal with, but mostly with the general picture that I think will be interesting for all of you, regardless of your background. So what I presented for you, what I have for you today is first of all an introduction to dynamic linguistics from a historical perspective. Maybe most of you don't really know what that is about, but it's something that goes all the way back, even beyond the foundation of modern sociolinguistics. Then the concept of a polylectal, internally dynamic competence and multilingualism within it. How would a modular account of competence be able to account for multilingualism or bilingualism? Is that possible? In many cases, many people left behind modular approaches to language precisely because of that, because of neglecting variation, neglecting the fact that competence is inherently variable. Then I will devote most of my time to Balgo as a non-polyglossic multilingual community, and I will finish with some avenues of future research. Let's see if time does not betray me. I tend to go beyond time. We'll see if that's not the case today. Okay, so please write down your questions, should you have any, and don't hesitate, any question is welcome. Okay, so what is the linguistics wars and what happened during the linguistics wars? The linguistics wars is a very important period in the history of linguistics that in which there were two groups of linguists, what today the modern Chomskyan generative linguists, and another group of linguists called the so-called generative semanticists. They were also known back in the day, as they were very young students, as one of these writers, the writers of the apocalypse. But that is well, there was a joke back in the day, and basically they were against the idea that a competence in the mind of a speaker was purely syntactic. For them, competence in the mind of speakers had to be semantic, and in many cases had to incorporate also uh, what we know today as variation. These radically separated these people from the original Chomskyans, from the original generativists, and they founded a new school that was to be known later on as generative semantics. For them, what is in what Chomskyans call a deep structure, there is a semantic analysis that through transformations gets to form what we nowadays know as surface structures or shallow structures. However, for a traditional generative semanticist that, well, they still exist, it's not that they have separated. I have picked the view from Søren here. To know a language does not only mean to have the ability of converting meanings into well-formed strings of symbols and vice versa, but also to be able to distinguish between standard, substandard, formal, informal, dialectally and sociolectally marked forms of speech. And also, if I may add something to these quote that I really like, is that also to know language also entails and how to play in the dynamism of multilingualism. But there is a language problem, and this is something that brought me to this field. You know, it was not easy to get rid of all my very structuralist ideas of language. But when I was starting my career as a linguist, one of the things that most linguists wanted from me was, okay, you want to be a typologist, you want to describe a language, then you have to write a grammar. That was the thing, you know, the grammar. Okay, I have to write a grammar, beautiful. But when I went to all these places where I have worked in the Amazon, in the Xingu, in Taiwan, and now in Australia, what I noticed was that writing a grammar would not have necessarily mean capturing competence, you know. In any way, that was extremely far. Well, not just because it's a book, you know, it's totally external, but also because in many ways it was neglecting reality. And I, as a scientist, could not bear that, you know. So I ended up with the idea that writing grammars is merely the practice of art, you know. And why is that? Because it's a great idealization, you know, of how languages are. You know. What you can find in grammars is a total idealization of competence. The thing you will find in a grammar, you will not find it in any single speaker. It is basically a formalization of how well or how bad a particular linguist managed to capture the constructions used by several speakers more frequently. And there's nothing more beyond that. But when you go into the field and you talk to the speakers, you see that beyond those common structures, there are things that pertain a lot to the individual sphere, to the private sphere, and also you find a lot of, well, what these conferences about multilingualism, you know, that we tend to call that multilingualism because it's very difficult to divorce ourselves from these language problem, you know, the notion that we really need to maintain language A, language B, language C, you know. But what you see is that these speakers use all these languages with one competence, right? As if they were using them with specific meaning, you know, talking to each other, using one specific set of features to talk to speaker A, another set of features to talk to speaker B, then one specific formal set of features to talk to speaker C. And these features may come from very different groups of so-called languages. So how can I really formalize that? How can I write a grammar? How can I provide a formal description of a language if speakers do that? It's difficult, right? But that difficulty is reality, and I think we cannot neglect it. So the language problem goes well beyond my own anecdotes. It has been discussed thoroughly in the field. But one of my contributions to the field has been the notion of the glossography of power. What is a glossography of power? It's a term that I have introduced into linguistics from anthropology. Actually, it was called the topography of power, and it has a lot to do with colonialism and the fact that many of the notions of people and language, in this case, language in particular, of where a language begins and where a language ends, have been imported from colonial views or are created wearing colonial lenses, you know. So where the languages begin or start um, is very colonial in many ways, and possibly the landscape of the country we are in nowadays, we are standing, um, was not the way it is if we have a look at the maps. The good thing is that we see, of course, the beauty of those very diffuse countries, that it means that the territories is not totally static, but still, what if pieces and ingredients of of those beautiful colors were not there and are not represented at all? Yeah. Um, Many of these divisions we have nowadays, and that sometimes we impose ourselves as members of countries that had been colonized, are that, how to say, um, mimics of European topography or glossography, the way that languages and land are created and divided based on possession and many other things. So just food for thought. That's why I prefer the notion of lect that was created by Charles Bailey and presented in his book in 1973, that is a completely non-committal term for any bundling together of linguistic phenomena. As such, competence is polylectal, that is, a linguistic competence contains dozens, hundreds, millions of lects that may have very different origins and that may be used in very different situations. Here I present a difference, well, some radical difference between the static paradigm and the dynamic paradigm. I don't have much time to go through all of these, but should you want to know more about the differences between the static paradigm and the dynamic paradigm, you can, well, read Bailey or just maybe have a look at my Abrelin talk on YouTube, and I develop these ideas in more detail. So this is a very simplistic representation of a polylectal internally dynamic competence. It's not a brain with several languages separated one from another, but competence is, let's say, a field where, well, all the languages play together, you know, and depending on parameters such as geography, sociology, who you talk to, that is the interactional parameter, and also history, so who you talk to, in what situations, where, etc. And also based on my historical background, the people I've talked to that have particular origins, I will modulate my competence and use different lects for specific situations. That was more or less what I was trying to sketch at the beginning without this theoretical background. So, okay, so how can we account for multilingualism? This is a beautiful picture of my consultants doing some frog story work in the Wakala Center in Balgo. You can ignore the tree. It's a typical generative semantics tree. But how are these people converting the semantic analysis into surface structures if they have these very complex competence? What's going on in their minds? That's the big question, and I don't know whether I'll be able to answer that today, you know. But that is what's going on, you know, and I think that's what I'm interested in nowadays. So how to capture multilingualism? That was one of the questions I had when I was still doing my PhD, and I went to the Amazon to do work with the indigenous Shawi. Here you see some pictures of them, pictures in the Amazon. This is the Shawi territory in the north of Peru. So this is the map of Peru. You see it here. This is a Kawapanan space. It's an area the size of modern Belgium, more or less. So Shawi is a widely spoken language. It has over 25,000 speakers. And if you have a look at it from a traditional Amazonian linguistics perspective, then you'd say, well, it's just a language. I write a grammar. It has interesting features that would account if either from a formal or functional point of view, they can tell you something about language. Okay, beautiful. But is that so simple? You know. But when I had a look at Kawapanan languages in general, there were interesting historical features there. For instance, that all Kawapanan pronouns seem to be shared with an isolate from Argentina, a language spoken 5,000 kilometers away. The nuclear lexicon is Carib. The technical and cultural lexicon and some part of its morphosyntax are Arawak. The numerals are based on the word for stone, as many languages spoken along a trade route that goes all the way from the Pacific into the Amazon. The grammar of the language, the basic skeleton of the language, is very similar to that of Quechuan and Aymaran languages, and it also has some features from Jivaroan languages. So if you leave all these things out, there's basically nothing left, but maybe a bunch of words that are, I don't know if we can say that such a thing exists, 100% Kawapanan. But beyond the fact that you could talk about substrata or things like that, the interesting thing is that this is telling us a story of pervasive indigenous multilingualism, of tons of contact, people having, being in touch with many different languages, right? And through contact after time and the history of colonialism, etc., Shawi is created with all these features, but people still maintain these features and then recognize them when speakers of other languages use them. So if I'm trying to provide a grammatical, lexical, etc., overview, description of the language, what do I do with this? Should I just neglect it? I think I shouldn't. That's maybe a personal stance. Okay, but these made me curious about what's going on in modern indigenous societies when there is pervasive multilingualism. You know, when multilingualism is there, rampant, when it's alive. You know, how does such a system is created, and that is what took me up to Balgo. You know, this is a nice picture of, it was a bit controversial, but it was engineered together with my consultants there in the field. And this is a picture of my Kokoja Learner's Guide that's coming out, hopefully, fingers crossed, before the end of the year. It's already kind of in press. And these are some of my consultants. This portrays in a way, in a cartoonish way, the landscape of the beautiful Tanama Road and the surroundings of Balgo. So Balgo is a community somewhere here in the Kimberley region in modern Kokoja country. It's here in WA in Western Australia. However, if you have a look at this map in sometime in the late 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, you'll see that there was no Kokoja country, or people knew nothing about Kokoja country. You will see that the Walmajari were there, that the Jaru were there, the Ngadi were there, and mostly what is modern Kokoja country was either partially Walmajari, partially Jaru, partially Ngadi. So where do these Kokoja people come from? And that's precisely when you have to, I want to show you a nice picture. Okay, ignore the questions there. But Kokoja people, this is a nice pictorial representation, beautiful piece of art by Melissa Sunfly. uh, this is Kokoja country, and Kokoja country is a place where people from many different backgrounds, such as the Walmajari, the Jaru, even the Punopam and the Kija, and many Western Desert tribes, gather together and form a community in times of the Catholic missions. You know, the Catholic missionaries in a way reduced these people into this community, and they decided that Kokoja, a Western Desert variety, was going to be used as the lingua franca. And that's how it came to be. However, of course, it was not the only language used. Still in Balgo, people, you can hear Walmajari, you can hear Jaru, there's Ngari speakers, for instance, the people I have been talking about, Jupiter and Mari, they are speakers of Ngati, of Kokoja, of Walpri, tons of Walpri speakers, speakers of other Western Desert varieties or Wati varieties. But Kokoja, in a way, has incorporated features from all these languages. It's not the Kokoja that was described originally by people like Platt in the 60s in the South. That's a language more like Bijanjara. It's a very different language. It is as if it was a Western Desert variety that uses Ngumpinyapa grammar. And with Ngumpinyapa, for the ones that are not acquainted with the languages of Australia, is a family spoken up. Remember, it's in this part of the map, here. So languages as Walpri, Jaru, Walmajari, Kurinji, Mudbura, these are Bilinara as well, Ngariman, these are all Ngumbinyapa languages, okay? So in Balgo, I have worked with over 39 people. Balgo is a community of approximately 300 people, 19 young adults, 10 adults, 10 elders, 10 women, 29 men. Sadly, because of all these gender cultural Can you hear me again? Yeah, just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me again. Okay, perfect. Sorry, I moved something there. So women, it's difficult to have women as consultants in many cases. With elders, it's a lot easier, but because of these gender cultural barriers, okay, and there are no monolinguals at all. So that idealism we have of the speaker, the perfect speaker, that definitely doesn't exist there. You know? People speak at least 2 languages, and some over 7 if we want to maintain that sharp divide. But what we see is that people are constantly mixing all the time, mixing everything, or remixing in the desert. Actually, that title comes from the fact that these young people there, they call their language variety Kokoja Remix, the variety they use with their peers. Some others call it Inkuja, but these especially in particular, these friends of mine, they use Kokoja Remix, and they rap in the language. It's very interesting. So these are some pictures of my consultants. This is my major collaborator, George, is one of the most respected men in the community. He knows a lot about the history. He's a very respected community intellectual in Balgo, and these are, well, some of my consultants. And you see, well, they are playing, yes, but when they are playing games, they speak these particular version of the language that I'm interested in. I'm trying to avoid the word language, but it's inevitable sometimes, Okay, the picture of Kokoja is complex. If we want to maintain all these sharp divisions, actually, I would just say that it's more of a circle, where there are many tons of ingredients that are completely mixed, but at some point we have to maintain these divisions to provide a picture, a temporary picture. So we have a variety that we call Old Kokoja, which is very similar to all the Bijanjara or Yagunjajara varieties, southern varieties of Western Desert. that we find in the legacy recordings of the Wakala Center in Balgo. Then we have, after the relocation of these speakers and their contact with speakers of Walmajari, Jaru, Wumanyapa languages, Walpri, a lot of Walpri actually, but Walmajari mainly, we have these variety Mission Kokoja, where also Australian English, Aboriginal English, and Creole were introduced. And most modern living elders are the ones that speak this variety that has some influence of Northern Australian Creole. Then we have New Kokoja. These New Kokoja spoken by people the age of George, say the late 30s, early 40s. This New Kokoja is a bit less creolized, a bit more standardized because of the influence of the Catholic priests, the creation of the Kokoja dictionary, etc. I'd say that my Kokoja Learner's Guide is basically based on these New Kokoja. And now we have these Inkuja. But this Inkuja or Kokoja remix that I was mentioning before is, or at least the speakers of these variety are also competent in New Kokoja, you know, and the Mission Kokoja speakers understand Inkuja, of course, and sometimes can even play with it, you know. So it has a lot to do with indexicality, you know, what these people actually want to, how they want to build, construct their identities in particular situations, okay. If we have a look at the varieties, or sorry, the features, I'm talking nonsense, that Kokoja and Inkuja share, or they don't share, where for instance, Kokoja has no diphthongs as most Western Desert languages. Inkuja shows some diphthongs. Kokoja has a typical Pama-Nyungan phonological inventory. Inkuja has this Pama-Nyungan inventory plus an S, the plural S is actually, which Kokoja doesn't have, you know, so you can hear things as tuchus, meaning women, puntus, meaning men, sometimes even chantus, meaning dogs, you know. Inkuja also uses the terminus, like the English the, you know, that's actually a calc, because in Inkuja, it comes from the Kokoja words Jijan Ngaja, and also there in Inkuja, it has a rich tense, mood, and aspect system. At least that's the case for Kokoja. In Inkuja, that's been totally reduced. The system is more transparent, using more time words, time expressions from either Kokoja or Creole, but some have been maintained. This is not, I would say, it's not fossilized yet. No, it's not reified as a whole variety. So still, there are many changes going on. Kokoja is full of Ngumpinyapa coverb constructions. A coverb is a construction in which you have an inflecting verb. You have a number of inflecting verbs, say 10 to 13, and then you have all the rest of the verbs that are not inflecting, which carry the actual meaning. You know, we will see a few in a bit. And Inkuja still has these Ngumenyapa coverb constructions, but they have been sometimes mixed with Creole verb frames. Okay. Inkuja retains ergativity. Inkuja has complex predication in the same way as Kokoja. Inkuja has less serialization, and it also lacks most of the sentence modifiers that the linguist Valiquette found in the early 90s. But of course, that is a very structural way of looking at Inkuja, right? And if I want to tell you the truth, if I want to say what's actually going on, I would say that speakers really jump from one place to another constantly. You know, of course, as a descriptivist, sometimes I have to put the line, but I always say is a bit of an idealization for methodological purposes, as I want to understand what's going on in this speaker's competence. But if there is such a pure Inkuja in the mind of any of these speakers, I doubt it. Now, is there identity related to these Inkuja? Yes, there is. There is a lot of identity. People feel that Inkuja is a new Kukaja, a very new Kukaja, you know, and they want to portray their identity as rebel younglings, you know, to the world by using it. And speakers like Mari, for instance, don't like it. They say, we don't want this in our community. But I have talked to her personally. I have said, well, you know, you also introduced tons of Creole back in the day in the mission, you know, and they just laugh and they say, yeah, we're speaking Creole. So it's something that's a lot of these view of the standard, this reified view of the standard comes, I think, from our colonial lenses, you know. Sometimes it would be good to get rid of that and try not to contagiate that to the communities we work with. But as I say, that's my opinion. Okay, let's have a look at some examples of Kukaja and Inkuja. Here we see an example in Kukaja. Chilu timanalu kamunchilu kalayalu puntu lampan pajano. That horse and that emu bait the small man. For instance, well, in this case, you see the ergative marker, you know, marked across, well, all members of an NP. Then a typical verb, bite with the past tense. And then once we see this, you know, by the way, yes, I'm about to finish. Sorry, I was not checking the time. I'm about to finish. Yeah, but here we see, it's just to show this because this is important. This is interesting. The fact that, well, it has incorporated this there, you know, but still carries the ergative marker. Here we see the verb bite, but with a Creole frame, but still maintaining, if you have a look at this whole thing, the inflecting verb. This is an inflecting verb, and this is acting as a co-verb, but maintaining a Creole frame, which is really beautiful. Here we see some other examples that we can have a look, maybe if we have a bit more time during the questions time, but maybe you can focus on this, as Inkuja has incorporated many of the phrasal verbs, prepositional-like particles in daily speech. Now, if we have to give a picture, provide a realistic picture of the nature of Inkuja from a, what is Inkuja? Is it a mixed language? From a structuralist point of view, it could be. Is it a generational act? From a traditional sociolinguistics point, it could be. What type of mixed language? It's a bit like Urindi Creole. We can say a bit like Walpri, but not necessarily. Could it be considered a language in layers? Most definitely. You know, it has layers from Wamanyapa, the very late early Pamanyungan one, Aboriginal English, Creole. Yes. Is there a conventionalization of Creole Kukaja code switching? Somehow, yes. What percentage of Kukaja lexicon was maintained is still a question I'm trying to answer. And who brought Inkuja in Balgo? Well, all these questions could be answered in different articles, but I think that this picture answers the question. And Inkuja, or Kukaja in general, is but a linguistic representation of this picture in here, where people are constantly moving from one place to another and interacting with different people from different places, not necessarily based on the language, because this represents fluidity actually, but also with individuals, you know, and accommodating their competence based on that. So that's actually what's going on, you know. So this competence in the minds of each one of these speakers is actually full of intentions that come from the past, but that also portray their present and generate their identity. This is what modern dynamic linguistics is about. So in terms of the future, there are many other linguists currently working in from this dynamic point of view. You can see some of their pictures there, working on languages mostly from South America. I think I'm the only one looking at Australian languages from this perspective, but of course, more friends are welcome. And this is it. Nyamu, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting and valuable research area, I believe. And from now on, we're going to have our Q&A session. And there are quite a few of questions raised in the chat box, and Lisa will help you to answer those questions.
Yes.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi.
Tego, will you do that? Okay.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, thank you, Luis, for the presentations. Now, we have some question here from the audience. First is from Moa. She asks, do you believe that languages can exist and develop without such connections, or are they essential for language development?
So that has to do, maybe if I read the question here on the chat.
Yeah. Yeah, I read
that's historical.
Yeah.
Okay. If I believe without such connections, I don't believe. I'm sure they cannot exist without such connections, and that these historical, social, all connections are essential for language, and they may be at the very bottom of what is the nature of language.
Yeah, thank you for the answers. Now, another question is from Daniel. Is the difficulty in working with women also applicable if the researcher identifies as a woman and or is Indigenous Australian?
Very good question, especially if you want to do fieldwork in the future. Actually, that goes the other way around. If you're a woman, it won't be necessarily easy for you to work with men. Or if you identify yourself as a woman. Now you need to be particularly careful with our, if you identify yourself as a woman, you know, you will have, and well, you will not say, and you're not biologically, okay, a woman. I'm sorry if I'm using misnomers here, and you go into a community, you will have to deal with some prejudice. So that's also important to be taken into account, okay? Because, well, it's very common in fieldwork. But if you are a woman and you are, when you're Indigenous Australian, I think it would be a lot easier for you to work with other women in the community. I would love to go into the field with a woman so as to be able to also collect more data and work with Indigenous women in Balgo. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think we still have time for one more questions. This is from Lisa. How much have these languages in Balgo been influenced by English? And how does this correlate to particular social influences? For example, active missionary settlements.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it really does correlate strongly with social influence such as active missionary settlements, because it was the missionaries themselves that brought English into those communities. Remember that Balgo was one of the, I would say, the last places to be contacted with, that had contacted peoples, you know. So they had no contact with English before. Many did, of course, because, well, yeah. But apart from that, yeah, I would say that it has been heavily influenced by missionary. Maybe we can have an extra question.
We still have
Tego?
time. We still have time.
Okay, all right. So maybe from Josh here.
Yes.
Do you find that there is a split in terms of the origins of the verbal versus nominal morphology in Yingkuja, as has been documented for some mixed languages?
Beautiful question. Partially, you know, I would say that that many very Swadesh-like basic verbs are very in Kokoja, you know, but the rest is a mix between that Ngumen Yapa frame and the Creole frame, you know, the Cova plus Creole. So I would say that to some extent, maybe a 25%, it's similar to Kurinji Creole, Light Wool Prey, but not really in some other ways. Now, if you assume that, okay, but it's happening at the level of the verb, well, in that case, yes, in that case, it's similar. But apart from that, I wouldn't dare to give that sharp division because I don't believe in deterministic ways of accounting for language typology. For me, there is no such a thing as a structural deterministic trigger, but more of a circumstantial nature of structure. Okay.
Do you think some of these structures might become more like sedimented and more grammaticalized?
Could be, but I'm not an astrologist. Yes, maybe, you know, it would be interesting.
So you don't see any evidence of this yet?
No, well, I see a trend, but another thing that has to be taken into account is that English is rampant and very strong. So it could be the case that they simply disappear, you know? And another thing is that Inkuja is becoming more and more, I try to think of language history as a tension not between simplicity and complexity, but a tension between semantic transparency or more and less semantic transparency. For me, Inkuja is getting more towards the more transparent side. So if that is the case, I think a lot of Creole will be incorporated.
Right. Crystal, do we still have time?
No. Thank you very much, Luis. Such a great presentation, and thanks for all the answers. And from now on, we're going to have social mingling sections for about 30 minutes. You'll be allocated into one Zoom breakout, and then you can just have a chat about your research, or you can chat about your daily life casually. And after 30 minutes, you'll be automatically come back to this link, so you don't have to manually come back to this link. And for each room, there will be at least one moderator or panelist who will probably trying to take a photograph of your beautiful and handsome smiles. So please kindly let them take a photo of you during the social mingling sessions. Enjoy, guys, for 30 minutes, and I'll see you guys after 30 minutes.